it's obvious that this person had some premeditated aspirations.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Well, that was Patrick Kane, a family friend. He was on Fox News just a few hours ago, suggesting that the man who snatched 9-year-old Charlotte Sena had obviously premeditated the crime. Do you agree with him? Although his trailer in his mother's backyard is some distance from the Sena family home, 13 miles, his vehicle is listed to a property within 2 miles of the Sena home. Besides that, as a mailman, it makes sense that if he lived in the area, that sort of job probably meant he'd worked in the area. And if you think about the type of thing that happened, dropping off a letter in a mailbox, there are different ways to deliver messages. Well, that certainly is the sort of thing a mailman does. Which I think is quite interesting. And if he worked in the area, then he'd likely seen Charlotte before playing outside of this property. And so this crime likely happened within the dynamic we know so well and have come to know so well on this channel.
Social acceptance in sexual frustrations.
No, he covets. How do we begin to covet, Clarice? We begin by coveting what we see every day.
And what do you think Craig Ross Jr. covets? Leave your answers in the comments and let's see if we agree on this one. Before we get to the rest of this analysis, if you haven't subscribed to this channel, please do. If you're enjoying this analysis, please like, share, leave a comment. And by the way, it takes a little bit of courage to say what I'm going to say in this video. In order to be authentic, you kind of got to go against what a lot of people think and believe. And so you're telling them what they don't really want to hear. It's not going to be popular. And if it's not going to be popular, well, on YouTube, doesn't that mean you're shooting yourself in the foot? And so what should you do? Should you tell the truth and have intelligent analysis, or should you try to be popular and entertaining? Anyway, if you appreciate the authenticity of this channel, you can also hit the thanks button and let's get started. Now, I was surprised to see in my last video so many people suggesting Ross Jr. had found out where Charlotte lived simply by asking her. How did he know where she lived? Well, he just asked her. Well, you might think that makes sense, but then you've got to assume that if he didn't know where she lived when he snatched her, well, then he was prepared to commit a crime involving a ransom with a random child, knowing nothing about her, with no idea where he was going to have to deliver it. Think about it. If he was unlucky, he might have to deliver a letter to somewhere on the West Coast, or Canada, or France, right? Campers at these sorts of parks they can come from all over the country, even all over the world. And so I think this sort of thinking, which maybe isn't thinking, you're not really thinking about it, but this sort of thinking that it's a random act by a random individual, someone who simply opportunistically did something out of the blue, I think it speaks to a lot of ignorance and fragmented thinking in these sorts of cases. And if you know me and you know my books and you know my work, it's far more integrated. You don't just pluck things out of the air randomly. You try and integrate everything in some way that makes sense. And so if you don't mind, while we're dealing with this case, while we're on the topic of this kind of crime, I also want to deal with the misinformation that is associated with these sorts of cases. And hopefully, even if I change one person's mind, maybe 20 of you unsubscribe, maybe 50 of you unsubscribe, but if I can just change one person's mind, then I think I will have succeeded. And obviously it's difficult because everyone else is singing the same tune, and that seems to be the tune people want to hear. They want to be frightened. They want to sort of blame someone with a particular name that makes them feel good, right? But is that the truth? Anyway, let's start with this premeditation aspect. Although it's not absolutely clear either way, it's not 100% that it was premeditated, I do think it's more likely the crime wasn't random. You heard the family friend saying the same thing, that it wasn't an impulsive act. It wasn't Ross Jr. just hanging around a park on a Saturday. He just happened to be there, and a little girl simply happened to be there as well, by herself, in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, I think the ransom note is one clue, that the ransom note was always part of the plan.
Not a great plan.
If you think about it, he actually didn't want Charlotte. He didn't want Charlotte for Charlotte. He wanted money. She was simply a means to an end, to that end. On the other hand, if Charlotte never went by herself for that second loop, she never said, I want to go by myself, what would have happened? Possibly Ross Jr. was going to wait and wait and wait until an opportunity presented itself. Again, that's not random. That's planning, hiding, and premeditating. What's more likely is that the perpetrator here had seen the victim, had seen her family, had seen the home, had seen bicycles at the back of the camper, and predicted they would go camping nearby and that the kids on their bikes would disconnect from the immediate vicinity of their parents, and that would present him with this opportunity. And I think all of this had been premised on seeing the kids at the home, possibly on bicycles as well. So do you see, he's connected to the victim by something very obvious, location. He probably occupied a property for a time barely 2 miles from the Sena home. And if he delivered mail there, then he had an excuse to approach the house at fairly close quarters in a way where nobody would notice him. And probably over a period of time, it's a young family, young kids, he probably saw things that gave him some idea, some familiarity in who he was dealing with. He's also connected in another way as a result of that. He covets. He probably covets a lot of things. But one of them is the comfortable circumstances of the Sena family. His circumstances are less comfortable. His family and his social situation are a lot less congenial. And so he probably noticed it. He probably noticed, wow, this is a really nice, happy family. And someone was saying, well, they're not necessarily rich. Why would he target them? Well, it's rich compared to what? Well, to himself. And though hardly a good person, his motive isn't nearly as nefarious as we expected. His motive is quite clearly money, and it would be interesting to know how much money he asked for. We can see that from his domestic and health circumstances that he is likely in financial difficulty. An interesting question is whether he would have committed this crime if his health wasn't compromised. What do you think? Now, this is where we get to the unpopular aspect. I watched another channel recently, much bigger than mine, where the analysis, if you can call it that, focused for 20 minutes on calling the perpetrator names and saying how scary it was. That particular video has gotten 100,000 views, about 10 times as many views as my videos get. It's very reassuring for the audience calling someone names in true crime. You sort of feel like you know what is going on. One has a sense that you've now resolved all uncertainty. But that's not how you find out who someone is. I mean, if you're still looking for someone, if you're trying to investigate a case, even if you've caught the person and you're trying to figure out what happened, that's a good recipe for not solving cases. If there had been no ransom note or no clues on the ransom note, and the police in this case had fixated on sexual offenders in the area, do you think they would have caught this individual? If that had been the little keyhole through which they'd focused their investigation, we're absolutely certain we know what this is. Let's target sexual offenders. Do you think they would have found Charlotte? Because that sort of bias blinds us. It doesn't help us any better, let alone insightfully. You might say, blah, 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 but that's exactly what happened in the Kylie Rodney case. That is what happened when Kylie Rodney was actually found. That is what the police were looking for. sexual offenders in the area. Now, in the name calling I've seen in this case, before Ross Jr. was identified, and even now, even since, it's actually been incorrect. Proper investigators let the information guide them, and you base your knowledge on clues and symptoms and the fabric of the case. And you try to stay curious, and you let the evidence guide you. You don't endlessly project labels and names and cliches on people and circumstances you knew nothing about 48 hours ago. I mean, it sounds very confident, it sounds very knowledgeable, but it's actually not. In reality, and I know many of you don't want to hear this, the perpetrator in this case didn't have a sexual motive, as far as we know, as far as we have in terms of our information as it currently stands. At this point in time, there doesn't seem to be any sort of record for sexual offenses. And I think if the true crime community is honest, you'll admit that's exactly what many of you were thinking. And it's something that is certainly possible. The question is it probable? And why have so many people thought this way? Well, because we've been trained to think this way from the nonsensical aftermath of the Ramsey and McCann cases. Those cases have programmed people to believe that this is what always happens in a situation with a little girl. Is it? Can I ask you, how many children do you think are taken by strangers in the United States per year? Is it 100,000? Is it 10,000? Is it 1,000? Or is it closer to 100? The number is somewhere around 100, more or less, give or take. If it's the number, let's say it's 350, it means one child, less than one child for every 1 million people in America. 1 out of 1 million. So if you take the official stats, according to one source, only about 100 cases per year are classified as children snatched by strangers. In other words, a child in America has about a 0.0001% chance of being snatched by a stranger. And I think many of you would have thought what happened to Charlotte is happening all the time. No, it's actually extremely rare. This incident also suggests that children are taken every day by strangers in America. But America isn't even in the top 10 of this list of countries with the worst rates of this sort of crime. If you want to be fearful about your child, worry about someone you know, someone very close to the child, someone perhaps the child knows. If you want to know how these sorts of crimes happen, well, here it is. A little child on her own in an open area outside of the house in a publicly accessible environment. We're talking about where strangers snatches a child. A child is in some ways more at risk in their own home, according to the statistics. Now, what we have here with Charlotte Sena is not breaking into a private residence while everyone is at home. It's not breaking into a holiday apartment and then walking in the streets under so many balconies. It's like walking across the field of a stadium. And I've been in front of the Ramsey home, and I've been to Praia da Luz in Portugal. I know exactly what it looks like and it feels like. I know how many windows look down upon that grate where the intruder supposedly went in the Ramsey case. Statistically, strangers are the most likely to snatch children as they head to or from school. According to a U.S. Justice Department report, 99.8% of children reported missing are found alive. The criminal's number one priority is getting in and getting out as quickly as possible without being seen. The forest and the perpetrator's knowledge of the area in this case and his knowledge of his target gave him an advantage in this sense, I think. Otherwise, if you don't know your target, you may be at a significant disadvantage. Who are their friends? Who are their parents? Where are their parents? Anyway, based on the poll I put on my channel, I'm pleased to see that 2/3 of my subscribers have their thinking caps on. I agree that grabbing Charlotte wasn't random or opportunistic, and even if we didn't know where Ross Jr. lived or what he did for a living, if all we knew is he posted the letter, it would still be very likely that what happened was planned. There's planning after the crime, there's very likely planning before. The man who took Cleo Smith in Western Australia, also from a campsite, had also premeditated his crime. Even though he'd been following that family on Facebook. Even though we can be almost certain this crime was premeditated, we still need to remain curious because we don't know for sure, and we have to leave the door open to that possibility. Yes, it's an unlikely possibility that it wasn't, right? The other thing is the sexual aspect we also don't have absolute certainty about, and so we must still remain curious, which is probably what the police are doing now, trying to be absolutely certain that this person didn't commit other crimes and crimes of a different nature. Does that make sense? Incidentally, if you're listening to this far, you might find this quite amusing. I have some experience as a mailman. I worked as a mailman for about a month when I lived in the United Kingdom. They gave me a bicycle and a bag, and pretty heavy. There's a lot of mail in those days. And you then do get to know the fabric of a neighborhood like the back of your hand. You get to know some of the people who live there. Sometimes you have one-on-one encounters with people. You get to know some of their habits. And I remember one house I delivered to in the area of Maidenhead. The people were related to Richard E. Grant. He starred in LA's Story and more recently the last Star Wars movie. How about that? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.